Japan made choices that changed everything. Some decisions seemed smart at first, but they led to massive consequences nobody saw coming. One move triggered a sleeping giant, another ignored a critical warning, and one choice made their own people turn against them. These weren't small errors. These were game-changing decisions that sealed their fate in the Pacific. But the biggest mistake? That one still shocks historians today. Attacking Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. A date that changed everything. Japan launched a surprise attack on America's Pacific Fleet. The plan seemed brilliant at first, destroy the ships before America could fight back. But they made a critical error. They hit the battleships, old technology, slow-moving targets sitting in the harbor. But the aircraft carriers weren't there that day. Those carriers survived, and they became the most dangerous weapons in the Pacific. Every battleship Japan destroyed was replaced within months. America's factories worked around the clock building new ships. Even worse, the attack united America overnight. Before Pearl Harbor, most Americans wanted to stay out of a war. They were divided, unsure. But after the attack, that changed instantly. Millions of men rushed to enlist. Factories converted to war production. The sleeping giant was awake now, and it was angry. But there's something Japan's leaders didn't calculate: underestimating American industrial power. Japan's military leaders looked at the numbers wrong. They saw America as soft, unprepared, not ready for a real fight. They believed their warrior spirit would overcome everything. They were so wrong. America's factories could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. One American shipyard produced more tonnage than all of Japan combined. The numbers were staggering. America built over 100 aircraft carriers during the war. Japan built 17 total. American factories rolled out planes by the thousands every month. Japan couldn't keep up. Their economy was smaller, resources limited, and they were fighting across thousands of miles of ocean. Every lost ship was irreplaceable. Every fallen pilot couldn't be replaced fast enough. Meanwhile, America's production only increased. By 1943, the gap was impossible to close. Japanese commanders realized their mistake too late. The industrial monster they awakened was unstoppable now. But production wasn't their only miscalculation. Ignoring their own intelligence reports. Japan's intelligence officers saw the warning signs. Reports landed on commanders' desks every week. Clear data, honest assessments, detailed analysis of America's growing strength. The leadership threw them away. One report showed America breaking Japanese communication codes. Another revealed the true size of American industrial capacity. Field officers warned that defensive lines were too thin. Nobody listened. Pride clouded their judgment. They believed destiny was on their side. Traditional values would triumph over Western technology. The culture of the military made it worse. Junior officers couldn't question senior commanders. Speaking uncomfortable truths meant dishonor. So the warnings stopped coming. Meanwhile, reality painted a different picture. American codebreakers read every Japanese message. They knew ship movements before attacks happened. Ambushes were set up days in advance. Intelligence failure cost them everything. Battle after battle was lost because commanders refused to accept the truth. And speaking of battles, the Midway operation. 6 months after Pearl Harbor came their biggest gamble. Japan planned to capture Midway Island, the tiny piece of land in the middle of the Pacific. The goal was to draw out America's carriers and destroy them. It was a trap, but not for America. Japanese commanders sent their best carriers into battle, 4 of them, the pride of their navy. Elite pilots, experienced crews. But America knew they were coming. Codebreakers had revealed the entire plan weeks earlier. American carriers waited in ambush, hidden beyond the horizon. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, Japan lost all 4 carriers. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots went down with them. Years of training erased in 72 hours. This was the turning point. Japan would never recover from Midway. Their offensive power was broken. From this moment forward, they would only defend and retreat. American forces pushed closer every month. But the loss of carriers wasn't even their worst mistake. Spreading forces too thin. Japan tried to conquer half the Pacific at once. They attacked in every direction: the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, Indonesia, islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Each conquest required troops to hold it. Supply lines stretched impossibly long. Ships had to travel weeks to deliver food and ammunition. Fuel consumption became a nightmare. Defending everything meant defending nothing well. When America started pushing back, Japan couldn't reinforce quickly enough. Isolated garrisons were cut off and eliminated one by one. The strategy made no sense logistically. Every island needed supplies. Every base needed protection, but they didn't have enough ships or planes to cover it all. American forces exploited this weakness perfectly. They bypassed heavily defended islands, struck at weaker points, and let isolated Japanese forces wither without supplies. Thousands of soldiers were abandoned on remote islands. No food, no reinforcements, no way home. They held positions that no longer mattered strategically. The overextension doomed them from the start.
Failing to protect supply lines. Japan's armies couldn't fight without supplies. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Everything had to travel by ship across hostile waters, thousands of miles from home. They left their cargo ships defenseless, while America organized convoys with destroyer escorts and air cover. Japan sent supply ships alone, slow-moving targets, easy prey for enemy forces. American subs hunted them relentlessly. One by one, supply ships disappeared beneath the waves. Oil tankers never reached their destinations. Troop transports sank with thousands aboard. By 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was almost gone. They started the war with 6 million tons of shipping. By the end, less than 10% remained. Armies starved on isolated islands. Air forces couldn't fly without fuel. Factories shut down from lack of raw materials. The submarine campaign strangled Japan slowly, and they never developed an effective counter-strategy. No convoy systems, no anti-submarine tactics, no protection for their lifelines. Their empire was dying from within. Treating occupied populations harshly. Japan needed the territories they conquered, resources, labor, strategic positions, but they ruled with brutal control that created enemies everywhere. Local populations were treated as inferior. Harsh penalties, forced labor, little regard for civilian suffering. This strategy backfired completely. In the Philippines, guerrilla fighters harassed Japanese forces constantly. In China, resistance movements tied down hundreds of thousands of troops. In Burma, local populations helped allied forces. If Japan had treated occupied peoples better, they might have gained valuable allies. Instead, they created resistance movements that sabotaged operations and provided intelligence to the Allies. The harsh treatment also gave America and Britain powerful propaganda. Stories of occupation hardships turned world opinion against Japan. Neutral countries became hostile. Every conquered territory became a drain on resources rather than a source of strength. More troops were needed to control angry populations. Supply lines were constantly attacked. They conquered territory but made it worthless. And this brutal approach had another consequence. the decision to fight to the last man. Japanese military culture emphasized honor above survival. Surrender was considered the ultimate shame. So commanders ordered troops to fight until eliminated. Every island, every battle, to the last person. This policy was strategically disastrous. When positions became hopeless, defending them served no purpose. Troops that could have retreated and fought again were lost forever. Experienced veterans eliminated in meaningless last stands. America learned to exploit this. They isolated Japanese positions and moved on. Let them sit and starve. No need to waste American lives in direct assault. Meanwhile, Japan lost irreplaceable trained soldiers. Each battle consumed their shrinking pool of experienced fighters. New recruits couldn't match the skill level of veterans. The philosophy also destroyed morale on the home front. Families knew their sons and brothers would never come home. No prisoners were taken, no survivors returned. And when the war reached Japan's home islands, this mentality made the situation even worse. Civilians were told to fight with bamboo spears. Schools trained children for final defense. The refusal to consider alternatives led to unimaginable consequences. Neglecting air defense. Japan built powerful offensive air forces. Their fighters and attack planes were excellent at the war's start. Skilled pilots, good aircraft design, impressive combat records. But they ignored defense completely. Few radar stations, limited anti-aircraft weapons, no organized civil defense system, no plan for protecting cities from air raids. When American bombers reached Japan, they faced minimal resistance. Cities burned with little opposition. Industrial centers were destroyed methodically. The home islands had almost no protection. Fighter planes that could have defended cities were sent to fight offensive battles elsewhere. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed severely. By 1945, American bombers flew in daylight with minimal losses. They struck any target they wanted: factories, ports, transportation networks, cities filled with civilians. Millions of people had nowhere to hide. Air raid shelters were inadequate. Fire prevention was primitive. Whole neighborhoods vanished in single raids. The lack of air defense made Japan's homeland vulnerable, and there was no way to fix it by the time they realized the mistake. But another choice made things even worse: continuing the war after 1944. By late 1944, Japan's situation was hopeless. Their navy was destroyed, air forces decimated, supply lines cut, cities burning. Yet leadership refused to consider ending the war. They kept fighting with no path to victory. Every day cost thousands more lives. Resources were completely exhausted. Food shortages gripped the home islands, but surrender was never discussed seriously. The reasoning was based on honor, not strategy. Admitting defeat meant losing face. So they continued a war they knew they couldn't win. This decision condemned millions to unnecessary suffering. Cities that burned in 1945 could have been spared. Soldiers who perished in the final year died for nothing. Even when Germany surrendered in May 1945, Japan fought on alone. No allies remained, no hope of rescue, no possibility of turning the tide. The leadership's refusal to face reality made the final months the deadliest. More Japanese people lost their lives in 1945 than in any previous year. And the worst was still coming.
Because their next choice led to an ending
nobody wanted. Rejecting surrender terms. July 1945, the Allied powers issued an ultimatum: surrender unconditionally or face complete destruction. The terms were clear, simple. Japan's leaders received the message. They chose to ignore it. Some military commanders believed they could still negotiate better terms. Others thought honor required fighting regardless of consequences. The decision to reject the offer sealed Japan's fate. What came next changed warfare forever. America had developed a new weapon, something Japan's leadership couldn't imagine, a superweapon that could erase a city in seconds. If they had accepted the terms, 2 cities would still be standing. Hundreds of thousands would have lived. The war would have ended in July instead of August. But pride and military tradition prevented rational thinking. The concept of unconditional surrender was unacceptable, so they gambled with their nation's future. On August 6th, reality arrived. Then again, on August 9th. 2 cities vanished. Finally, surrender came. But the price paid for those extra weeks was catastrophic. The rejection of surrender terms became their final strategic disaster. Poor pilot training programs. Early in the war, Japan had the world's best pilots. Experienced, highly trained, skilled in combat. They dominated the skies initially. But Japan made a critical mistake in how they handled this advantage. They never rotated experienced pilots home to train new ones. Veterans stayed in combat until they were eliminated. All that experience and knowledge died with them. New pilots received minimal training before being sent to fight. America did the opposite. They rotated experienced pilots back home regularly. These veterans trained the next generation, shared combat lessons, improved tactics and techniques. By 1943, the difference was obvious. American pilots had hundreds of flight hours before combat. Japanese pilots sometimes had less than 100 hours total. The skill gap became impossible to overcome. New Japanese pilots didn't survive long enough to gain experience. Each loss made the problem worse. Eventually, Japan resorted to desperate measures. Pilots with barely any training were sent on missions they couldn't survive. The final operations were essentially sending people to certain ends. The failure to build a sustainable training program destroyed Japan's air power. Ignoring technological development. Japan started the war with competitive technology, good aircraft, effective ships, decent weapons. But they failed to keep improving, while America innovated constantly. Their best fighter at war's end was barely improved from 1942. Meanwhile, America introduced faster, better-armed, longer-range aircraft every year. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Radar technology, radio equipment, anti-aircraft systems, engine design. America advanced while Japan stagnated. Part of this was economic. Research and development require resources Japan didn't have. But part was cultural. Leadership didn't prioritize innovation. They believed existing equipment was sufficient if pilots showed enough fighting spirit. Technology was secondary to willpower in their thinking. This attitude proved fatal. By 1945, Japanese equipment was generations behind. American fighters could outperform Japanese planes in every category. Radar-equipped ships detected Japanese forces before visual contact. The technological gap meant even skilled Japanese forces were at a severe disadvantage. And combined with all their other strategic errors, it guaranteed defeat. But one more decision made things even worse. Wasting resources on battleships. Japan believed massive battleships would dominate naval warfare. They built the Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed. Enormous guns, thick armor, symbols of Japanese naval power. They were obsolete before completion. The future of naval combat was aircraft carriers, not battleships. Planes could strike from hundreds of miles away. Battleship guns needed close range to be effective. Building these ships consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere. The steel and labor could have built multiple carriers, or dozens of destroyers, or hundreds of aircraft. And the battleships accomplished almost nothing. Yamato spent most of the war in port. When finally sent to fight, it was eliminated by aircraft without firing its main guns at enemy ships. Musashi met the same fate. Struck by dozens of air-launched weapons, sunk without contributing to any meaningful battle. The resources wasted on these floating fortresses represented everything wrong with Japan's strategic thinking. They built for the previous war, not the current one. Meanwhile, America built carriers and submarines, the weapons that actually mattered in the Pacific. Failing to develop effective submarines. Japan built submarines, good ones actually, well-designed, capable of long-range operations, but they used them completely wrong. Japanese doctrine assigned submarines to fight enemy warships. They attacked carriers and battleships, military targets only. America took a different approach. American submarines hunted cargo ships, tankers, supply vessels. They strangled Japan's economy slowly. Japan could have done the same. America's supply lines across the Pacific were vulnerable. Oil tankers from California, cargo ships from Hawaii, troop transports carrying reinforcements. But Japanese submarines rarely targeted these vessels. They waited for opportunities to strike military ships. Those chances were rare and well defended. The strategic error was massive. Sinking one oil tanker had more impact than damaging one warship. But Japanese military culture viewed attacking cargo as dishonorable. So their submarine fleet, which could have been decisive, accomplished relatively little. Another wasted advantage, another strategic choice. That helped guarantee their defeat.
And the pattern continued in other areas too. No unified command structure. Japan's military was divided against itself. The Army and Navy barely communicated. They operated as separate organizations with different goals, often working against each other. This created massive inefficiencies. The Army would plan operations without telling the Navy. The Navy made decisions that contradicted Army strategy. Resources weren't shared effectively. The Army developed its own aircraft. The Navy built different planes. No standardization, no cooperation on design or production. Intelligence wasn't shared either. The Navy might know something critical that the Army needed, but pride and rivalry kept information isolated. Compare this to America's approach. All branches worked under unified command, coordinated operations, shared intelligence, combined resources for maximum effect. Japan's divided command meant they often fought themselves as much as the enemy. Conflicting priorities, wasted resources, missed opportunities for coordination. On some islands, Army and Navy forces refused to cooperate, even under attack. They maintained separate headquarters, separate supply systems, sometimes separate defensive strategies. This internal division weakened Japan throughout the war, a self-inflicted wound that never healed. Underestimating Chinese resistance. Japan invaded China in 1937. They expected a quick victory. The Chinese military seemed weak, poorly equipped, divided by internal conflicts. Japan thought they'd conquer China within months. 8 years later, they were still fighting in China. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops were tied down, endless guerrilla warfare, constant ambushes, supply lines under constant attack. These troops could have been used in the Pacific, against America, but they remained stuck in China, achieving nothing strategic. The Chinese refused to surrender despite massive losses. They retreated inland, continued fighting, burned their own cities rather than let Japan have them intact. Japan never adapted their strategy. They kept pouring resources into China, trying to achieve total victory that never came. This campaign drained Japan before the Pacific War even started. Their army was exhausted, resources depleted, and they gained almost nothing useful from the occupied territories. The China operation was a strategic black hole. It consumed everything Japan put into it and returned nothing of value. But another mistake cost them even more. Poor intelligence on American capabilities. Japan's leaders believed things that weren't true. They thought American society was too soft to fight a long war. They believed American soldiers lacked fighting spirit. They assumed American production numbers were exaggerated. Every assumption was wrong. Intelligence agencies failed to gather accurate information, or when they did, leadership rejected reports that contradicted their beliefs. They didn't understand American culture. The idea that a democratic society could be tougher than a military one seemed impossible to them. They underestimated American resolve after Pearl Harbor. The attack didn't make America want peace, it made them want total victory. They miscalculated industrial capacity by massive margins. When told American factories could build a ship a day, they dismissed it as propaganda. But it was true. This intelligence failure meant Japan planned a strategy based on fantasy rather than reality. Every decision was built on wrong assumptions. By the time they understood the truth, it was too late. The gap between perception and reality had doomed them from the start. And this false understanding led to other catastrophic choices. Not building enough cargo ships. Winning the Pacific required moving supplies across vast ocean distances. Food, fuel, ammunition, equipment, everything needed to travel by sea. Japan started with a reasonable number of cargo ships, but they never built enough replacements. American submarines eliminated cargo ships faster than Japan could replace them. Each sunken vessel meant less capacity to supply their scattered forces. Japan prioritized building warships instead. Carriers, destroyers, combat vessels. These seemed more important than unglamorous cargo ships. This was backwards thinking. Combat ships need fuel and ammunition delivered by cargo vessels. Without cargo capacity, warships couldn't operate. America understood this perfectly. They built cargo ships in massive numbers. Liberty ships, Victory ships. Simple designs produced quickly and cheaply. By 1944, Japan's logistics network had collapsed. Islands ran out of food. Air bases had no fuel for planes. Troops couldn't be moved between positions. The shortage of cargo shipping strangled Japan's ability to wage war. Their empire couldn't be sustained without the merchant fleet they failed to protect or replace. Simple logistics defeated complex military strategy. Ignoring diplomatic solutions. War wasn't inevitable in 1941. Diplomatic channels remained open. Negotiations were possible. Compromises could have been reached. But Japan's military leadership rejected every peaceful option. They believed military force would achieve goals faster than negotiation. Pride and honor made compromise seem like weakness. Some Japanese diplomats tried desperately to find solutions. They proposed alternatives to war, suggested ways to ease tensions, looked for common ground with America. The military overruled them every time. Diplomacy was seen as a sign of weakness. Real strength came from military action, not talking. This rejection of diplomatic solutions meant Japan chose war when alternatives existed. They picked the path that led to their complete defeat. Even during the war, opportunities for negotiated settlement arose, but the same attitude prevailed. Fight until the end, never compromise. Honor over survival. If Japan's leaders had valued diplomacy as highly as military action, the entire tragedy might have been avoided. Millions of lives could be spared. But they chose differently and paid the ultimate price.
believing victory was destiny. Japan's greatest strategic error might have been psychological. They believed they were destined to win, that fate was on their side, that willpower and spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. This belief blinded them to reality. When faced with bad news, they dismissed it. When confronted with impossible odds, they insisted victory was still possible. When logic said retreat, pride demanded attack. The concept of inevitable victory infected every level of decision-making. Commanders planned operations assuming success. Intelligence that suggested otherwise was rejected. Resources were committed based on wishful thinking. American forces had no such illusions. They calculated odds carefully, planned based on realistic assessments, adjusted strategy when circumstances changed. Japan's belief in destiny made them rigid. They couldn't adapt when situations shifted. The original plan was followed even when it clearly wasn't working. This psychological error multiplied every other mistake they made. Poor logistics became catastrophic because they believed spirit would compensate. Technological disadvantages were ignored because destiny would provide victory. In the end, destiny had nothing to do with it. Strategy, resources, and realistic planning determined the outcome. And Japan had chosen to ignore them all.